Damon Leclerc stood in the heart of the Grand Casino, his usual air of arrogance barely noticeable in the swirling, neon-lit haze of alien chatter and music. His father's fortune surrounded him like a golden cage, a luxury he'd never known how to appreciate. At 30 years old, he was everything the galaxy envied and despised. Charming, wealthy, and utterly entitled. He'd made a career out of winning. Everything from business deals to hearts. And he'd never met a person he couldn't manipulate. Tonight was no different. The high-stakes gambling tables were surrounded by a mixed crowd of wealthy humans and powerful aliens, all eager to test their luck. Damon wasn't gambling for money. He was gambling for something much more valuable. A favor. With his family's financial future hanging in the balance, Damon was pushing all his chips into a single wager. He'd come to this alien world, Terra Celestis, seeking new opportunities, but more importantly, new ways to assert his dominance. What better way to show his power than to outplay the galaxy's most influential alien syndicates? If he could win this bet, he'd secure an alliance with one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy, cementing his position as the galaxy's top magnate. As the night wore on, Damon's focus narrowed. The game had shifted. He was no longer playing for money, but for pride. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. The alien businessmen who watched with open amusement and the smug satisfaction of knowing that no human had ever dared to outwit them before. Damon felt the challenge ignite a familiar thrill. He wasn't just playing for stakes, he was playing to dominate. The moment came when the head of the alien syndicate, a towering, metallic-skinned being named Zalcor, slid a slim datapad across the table. Damon, never one to back down from a challenge, leaned forward, glancing at the proposal without hesitation. "The terms are simple, Leclerc," Zalcor said in his deep, rumbling voice, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "If you win, we grant you favor, political access, military support, and influence beyond your wildest dreams. If you lose, well, we'll leave that for later. You'll know soon enough." He gestured to the datapad. "Sign, and the game begins." Damon's fingers hovered over the pad. The terms weren't entirely clear. He could feel the weight of something unspoken lingering in the air. But he didn't care. The idea of losing was anathema to him. He was Damon Leclerc. No one beat him. Not in business, not in love, and certainly not in games of chance. He signed the document, his signature flashing across the screen in bright blue light. "Good," Zalcor said. "You'll find out your challenge soon enough. But there's one thing you should know, human. The one who wins this game isn't the one who controls the cards. It's the one who can control what's most precious to them." Before Damon could process the cryptic words, Zalcor made a subtle gesture. A door opened across the room, and a figure stepped into view. Damon froze. Standing at the threshold was an alien woman. She was taller than any human woman he had ever encountered, with skin like polished stone and eyes that gleamed with an unyielding strength. Her body was powerful and solid, marked with the physical prowess of someone who had spent years training. Yet her presence was tempered by a quiet, fierce elegance. But what struck Damon most was her size. She was undeniably larger than most women. Her broad shoulders, thick thighs, and towering height made her stand out even more. Her appearance was in stark contrast to the delicate, slender women Damon usually surrounded himself with, and a sharp pang of irritation gnawed at him. His pride flickered. What kind of alien were they forcing him into an arrangement with? Zalcor's voice cut through his thoughts. "Meet Nita. She's the one you'll be partnered with for the duration of this bet." Damon's first instinct was to scoff, but something about Nita's unflinching gaze made him pause. There was a strength in her presence, an unspoken authority that Damon didn't quite understand. "Her?" Damon said, trying to mask the confusion in his voice. "You expect me to be with her?" Nita didn't flinch. She merely met his gaze, her expression unreadable, her stance powerful. "You've been chosen, human. Don't waste my time," she said, her voice deep and steady, carrying an authority Damon hadn't anticipated. Damon's arrogance flared. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'll play along," he said. trying to regain control of the situation. He could already tell she wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status, which only added to his irritation. But you will regret this. I always win. Nita simply raised an eyebrow. We'll see. As the tension in the room built, Damon's confidence began to waver. What was he getting into? He had expected a glamorous, exotic alien beauty, someone who would serve as a trophy, an object to further his dominance. But this woman, this warrior, with her solid build and calm demeanor, was anything but what he'd imagined. Zalkor's voice brought him back to the moment. The terms of the challenge are clear. You will spend 1 year in her company, and you must prove that you are worthy of the favor you seek. It will not be easy, Damon Leclerc. Nita didn't say another word. She turned and began walking toward the door, her steps confident and sure. Damon, swallowing the knot in his throat, followed behind her, his mind racing. As they exited the casino, the cold night air of Terra Celestis hit him like a slap. He had never felt so uncertain in his entire life. This wasn't just a bet. It was a test of something far deeper. A test he wasn't prepared for. Nita didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly who she was and where she was going. Damon, for the first time in years, was the one who didn't know what to expect next. The transport pod hummed softly as it made its way through the city, weaving between the towering structures of Terra Celestis. Damon Leclerc sat in the plush seat, his thoughts swirling as he glanced at the alien woman across from him. Nita, her stoic face lit by the glow of passing neon signs, stared straight ahead. Her presence, even in the dim light, was impossible to ignore. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around it. This arrangement, this challenge. Damon had grown up in a world where people bowed to him, where his looks, his money, and his power guaranteed that everything and everyone bent to his will. But Nita was different. She was unmoved by his reputation, unimpressed by his wealth, and that irritated him more than he cared to admit. You don't say much, Damon remarked, trying to break the silence that hung between them. Nita's gaze flicked to him, and for a brief moment, her eyes softened, just a fraction. But she didn't respond right away. Damon waited, tapping his fingers against the armrest, still unable to shake the feeling that he was walking into something far deeper than he'd ever planned. You don't need me to say much, she said finally, her voice low but firm. This isn't about conversation. It's about understanding what you signed up for. Damon scoffed. And what exactly do you think I signed up for? A few months of playing pretend? What exactly is this bet about? Nita shifted in her seat, her powerful frame seeming to stretch even taller as she straightened up. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her muscles defined beneath the smooth, patterned armor she wore. She was dressed like a warrior, strong, commanding, and very much unlike any woman Damon had ever associated with. You think you control everything, don't you? She asked, her tone almost pitying. You think you can win this with your money and charm. But you'll quickly learn that this isn't a game you can cheat your way through. Damon bristled. I don't need lessons from you. I'm not here to teach you anything, Nita responded, her voice steady but unyielding. You're here because you made a choice. Now you have to live with it. Damon clenched his jaw. This wasn't going how he'd imagined. There had been no grand spectacle, no fireworks. The grand challenge, the stakes, all felt so distant now that he was face to face with the reality of the situation. He had expected to control the situation, expected that he could turn this into a game he could win. But Nita wasn't playing by the same rules. She wasn't just a pawn in his world of manipulation. They arrived at a massive estate on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling structure of glass and metal that reflected the alien skyline. Damon stepped out of the transport pod, his shoes clicking on the polished stone steps as he followed Nita into the house. It was luxurious, but the emptiness in the air was almost suffocating. No servants, no assistants, just the two of them. Nita led him inside, her movements deliberate and confident. She didn't offer him a tour or even a word of welcome. Instead, she led him straight to a large sitting room, its windows offering a panoramic view of the glittering city below. You can stay here in this room, Nita said, gesturing to a plush chair by the window. But the rules are simple. You won't be treated like royalty. You won't get any special treatment. You'll follow the terms of this arrangement, and nothing more. Damon's eyes narrowed. What does that mean exactly? Am I supposed to follow you around like some kind of pet project? Nita's gaze turned steely. I'm not your handler, Leclerc. I'm not here to make you feel comfortable. I'm here to make sure you keep your end of the bargain. Damon was silent for a moment, trying to process her words. His thoughts raced. What had he gotten himself into? The moment he thought he had control, the moment he thought he understood the rules of the game, it slipped out of his grasp. Nita didn't care about his power, his wealth, or his charm. She didn't care for anything he had ever relied on to get his way. She wasn't impressed, and that made Damon feel smaller than he ever had before. He finally took a deep breath and leaned back in the chair. All right, I'll play by your rules. For now. Nita stood near the window, her arms still crossed as she observed him. Don't mistake this for weakness. I'm not here to be your backup plan or your distraction. I'm here to remind you of what you've forgotten. That you can't control everything. Her words hit Damon like a slap. He wanted to retort, to fire back with one of his usual cutting remarks, but something stopped him. He was used to being the one who controlled the conversation, but with her, the silence between them held weight. It felt heavier than anything he had ever encountered. For the first time in years, Damon wasn't sure what came next. Let me be clear, Nita continued, her voice now tinged with a hint of something sharper, more serious. The terms of our arrangement are simple. You live here for a year. You abide by the rules. You don't try to manipulate me, and you don't try to cheat. If you break the terms, you lose. And that means you'll forfeit everything. Not just this bet, but everything you've built. Damon's gaze hardened. You think I'll lose? Nita's eyes locked with his, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. I think you'll try to win, but you'll lose the moment you start believing your own lies. Damon stiffened. You really don't know who you're talking to, do you? Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, one that held no amusement. I know exactly who I'm talking to. You're someone who thinks everything can be bought. Someone who's been told all their life that they're the best because they've had everything handed to them. But I'm not interested in your wealth. I'm not interested in your games. I'm interested in whether or not you'll learn to respect the truth. Damon didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words lingered in the air, suffocating him in a way he wasn't used to. He wanted to say something, anything, to assert his control, but for the first time in his life, he couldn't find the words. His usual confidence felt hollow in the face of Nita's quiet strength. For the first time, Damon realized that this wasn't just about winning a bet. It was about something far deeper. He didn't know it yet, but Nita was challenging more than his pride. She was forcing him to confront the very foundation of who he was. As the hours passed and night fell over Terra Celestis, Damon found himself alone in the luxurious sitting room, gazing out at the city lights. Despite the grandeur of his surroundings, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was in over his head. And as Nita disappeared into another part of the house, he knew one thing for certain. The next year would be far more than he had bargained for. Damon awoke to the soft hum of the house's automated systems, sunlight streaming in through the tall windows that overlooked the sprawling cityscape. He sat up in bed, rubbing his temples as the events of the past day came rushing back. He had expected the challenge to be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated just how unsettling it would feel to be in a position of uncertainty. Nita had made it clear he wasn't the one in control, and somehow that made him feel both frustrated and alive. The air around him seemed to carry a palpable tension, an unspoken challenge. He wasn't used to the lack of power, and it gnawed at him with every passing hour. After a brief breakfast, consisting mostly of strange fruits and unfamiliar drinks that Nita had prepared without a word, she directed Damon to a large, open space at the back of the house. The room was vast, with high ceilings and metallic floors that shimmered in the light, giving it a cold, industrial feel. But what caught Damon's attention was the assortment of training equipment arranged in a neat row along one wall. Nita stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed and her eyes locked on him. If you're going to survive here, you'll need more than just your wealth. You'll need strength, endurance, and discipline. Today, we begin. Damon raised an eyebrow. Discipline? This isn't exactly what I had in mind when I signed up for this little arrangement. She didn't flinch. Then perhaps you shouldn't have signed up at all. The sting of her words hit him harder than he was willing to admit, but he swallowed it down. His pride was the last thing he was willing to let go of, even in the face of her cold, unwavering demeanor. Fina, show me what you've got. Nita's eyes flickered for a moment, almost as if she were considering something. She uncrossed her arms and took a step toward him, her movement fluid and calculated. First, let's test your endurance. Without another word, she handed him a strange-looking device. It was a fitness tracker, but with more advanced features than any Earth technology Damon had ever seen. You'll run, she said, nodding toward the long stretch of open space in front of them. Around the room, 5 laps. If you can't finish, the session is over. Damon stared at her. 5 laps? Are you serious? Nita's gaze remained firm. You wanted a challenge. Now you have one. He hesitated for a moment, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He gritted his teeth and began to jog, his pace slow at first, but gradually increasing as the first lap came to a close. His body was more accustomed to luxury than exertion, but he was determined not to show weakness in front of her. By the 3rd lap, Damon's breath became shallow. His legs burned, muscles that hadn't been used in years protesting with every step. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his body moving in ways that felt unfamiliar and painful. But there was something else, something pushing him forward. He didn't want to fail. Not now, not in front of her. Nita stood silently, her arms crossed again, watching him with that same unreadable expression. Damon could feel her eyes on him. A steady, unwavering gaze that was both intimidating and oddly encouraging. He couldn't explain it, but it fueled something inside him. He pushed harder, forcing his body to keep moving despite the exhaustion creeping in. By the time he reached the 5th lap, Damon was gasping for air, his legs shaking with fatigue. But he crossed the finish line, stumbling slightly before catching himself. He stood there, hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. Good, Nita said, her voice devoid of praise but not without a hint of approval. You've passed the first test. But it's not enough. Damon straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. What do you mean, not enough? I just ran 5 laps. Nita didn't offer an explanation immediately. Instead, she motioned to a set of strange weights and devices in the corner of the room. Endurance isn't the only thing you'll need. You'll need strength, and the mental focus to push through when everything inside you tells you to stop. Damon was about to argue, but he stopped himself. She had a point. Everything he had relied on, his wealth, his charm, his ability to manipulate, wasn't in a matter here. Not with Nita. This wasn't about bending others to his will. It was about overcoming his own limitations. Let's get started, Nita said, her tone firm. Lift. Damon, still panting, hesitated but grabbed the nearest weight. It was heavy, much heavier than anything he'd ever lifted before. But he forced himself to press on. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. The hours passed in a blur of sweat and physical exertion. Nita didn't let up. Every exercise was followed by another, more demanding than the last. By the time the sun began to set, Damon's body was trembling with exhaustion. His muscles screamed in protest, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But there was a part of him, something deep inside, that refused to stop. It wasn't just his pride anymore. It was a flicker of something he couldn't explain. Finally, Nita called a halt to the training session. Damon collapsed onto the floor, his back flat against the cool surface, as he fought to regain control of his breathing. Not bad for a pampered human, Nita said, her tone surprisingly neutral. But you're nowhere near finished. Damon shot her a glare, though he was too exhausted to really feel the sting. He didn't know whether to be angry or relieved by her words. Part of him wanted to scream at her, to tell her he had given everything he had. But another part of him recognized something he hadn't expected to find. There was a strength in Nita, something raw, something real, that he could no longer ignore. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She wasn't moved by his power. She didn't care about his charm. What she cared about was whether or not he could face the pain, the struggle, and the truth of his own limitations. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to realize that he wasn't the man he had always thought he was. "I'm done for today," Damon muttered, still panting. Nita nodded, not offering any words of comfort or praise. "Tomorrow we continue. If you want to survive here, if you want to win, you'll have to do more than just show up." With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing against the cold walls. Damon lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. As exhaustion slowly gave way to a new kind of understanding, Damon realized that this challenge was far more than he had ever bargained for. And Nita wasn't just a part of the game. She was the game. The following days blurred together in a haze of grueling training and uncomfortable silence. Damon's body had begun to adjust to the physical demands of Nita's lessons, though he still couldn't shake the sense that he was barely scraping by. Every day he woke up sore, pushed to the brink of exhaustion, only to face another day of relentless tests. There were moments when he wanted to scream, to call it all off, but he knew that would be the end. This wasn't about physical endurance anymore. It was about something deeper, something more painful. The worst part of it all, though, was Nita's presence. She was always there, watching him, pushing him, reminding him that nothing came easy in her world. She was patient in a way that made Damon uneasy, as though she had all the time in the universe to break him down. And despite her cold, no-nonsense demeanor, there were moments, fleeting moments, when Damon would catch a glimpse of something more in her eyes. Something vulnerable, something raw. But those moments were brief, quickly hidden behind the walls she so carefully constructed around herself. This morning was different, though. As Damon stretched in the training room, waiting for Nita to begin the next round of exercises, something about the air felt tense, charged. It was as if everything around him had shifted, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Nita, too, seemed different, more restless, her sharp eyes flicking to him with a guarded intensity. She had never been one to offer any form of comfort or empathy, but today there was a trace of something almost human in her gaze. "You're late," Damon muttered, watching as she stood at the far side of the room, her arms folded across her chest. She had been punctual every day until now, and the absence of her usual strictness unnerved him. "I wasn't aware you needed my approval to begin," she replied, her voice cold as always. But Damon thought he detected a hint of something else, something guarded, like she was holding back. He didn't press her further, though, instead focusing on the next round of drills. He moved through the exercises mechanically, his body now conditioned to handle the physical strain, but his mind was elsewhere. A growing unease gnawed at him, like he was on the cusp of discovering something important, something he wasn't quite ready to face. An hour into the session, Nita called a halt, her voice sharper than usual. "Enough for today," she said, her tone almost dismissive. Damon paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, confused by her sudden change in demeanor. She was usually relentless, pushing him to the brink of collapse with each session. "What's going on?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Nita turned her gaze on him, but this time, her expression was harder to read than ever. "I don't owe you any explanations," she said flatly, but her lips pressed together in a tight line that betrayed her calm exterior. Damon's brow furrowed. "Is there something wrong? You're acting different." She took a slow breath, her gaze flicking away from him for just a moment. For a brief instant, she looked almost conflicted. But then, just as quickly, her mask slipped back into place. "No," she said, her voice rigid. "Nothing's wrong. Just move on with your day." Something about her words, her tone, struck a chord in Damon. He had learned to read people well, especially in business, and Nita's demeanor was completely at odds with her usual forthrightness. It was as if she were hiding something, a secret she was unwilling to share. "Fine," he said, though his mind was still racing with unanswered questions. He didn't push her further, but he could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Something had shifted, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with the usual training. As Damon made his way to his quarters, his thoughts lingered on the day's strange shift in Nita's behavior. He wasn't used to seeing cracks in her armor. She was strong, unyielding, the one person who didn't care about his status, his charm, or his wealth. But today she had seemed off, like she was struggling with something personal. Damon hated that feeling, the feeling of being outside someone else's control, unable to understand what was going on behind their eyes. He had always been the one who could manipulate situations, who could force others to reveal their weaknesses. But Nita was different. She wasn't susceptible to his tricks. And now, her sudden shift in behavior was pushing him further out of his comfort zone. Later that evening, after a sparse dinner, Damon found himself walking along the perimeter of the estate, his footsteps echoing against the stone path. He had no particular destination in mind, just a need to clear his head. The stars above shone brightly in the alien sky, their unfamiliar constellations seeming to mock him with their silent vastness. Damon had always thought he was the center of his own universe, but here, under the stars, it felt as though he were a speck of dust in an uncaring cosmos. A slight noise caught his attention, a rustle in the bushes nearby. He paused, turning toward the sound. His instincts were sharp, trained for more dangerous environments than this, but he found nothing, only the wind, rustling the leaves. As he took another step, his thoughts on the unsettling shift in Nita's demeanor, he heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. A soft, strained sound, almost like a sob. Without thinking, Damon turned and moved toward the sound. He rounded a corner of the estate, and there, hidden in the shadows of a tall hedgerow, was Nita. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her body shaking with the silent force of her emotion. She hadn't noticed him approaching. For a moment, Damon stood frozen, watching her. This was the first time he had seen her so vulnerable, so human. It was unsettling. He didn't know what to do, but something inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in a long time, urged him forward. "Nita?" he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and alert. But when they locked on his face, the wall behind her eyes softened just enough for Damon to catch a glimpse of the emotion swirling in them. I'm fine," she stammered, wiping her eyes quickly, as if trying to erase the evidence of her vulnerability. But Damon could see it. The tension, the grief that had cracked through her stoic exterior. "You don't have to pretend," Damon said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "What's going on?" Nita didn't respond immediately. She stood there, her body still trembling slightly, the weight of whatever burden she carried too much for her to conceal. Damon stepped closer, an unspoken understanding passing between them. For the first time, it wasn't about a bet. It wasn't about manipulation or winning. For the first time, it was about trust. But just as quickly, Nita took a deep breath, and the walls around her heart slammed back into place. "You don't need to know," she said firmly, her voice regaining its usual edge. She turned away from him, her back straight and posture proud once more. "Go back inside, Damon. You have training tomorrow." Damon stood there for a moment, staring at her retreating form, the quiet tension between them hanging in the air. There was more to Nita than he had ever guessed, more than he had bargained for. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whether he was ready to face the consequences of unraveling it all. The following morning, Damon could feel the weight of the silence hanging heavily between him and Nita. After the brief encounter in the garden the night before, he hadn't seen her all through breakfast, nor had she shown up for training. The usual routine had been thrown off, and though he tried to push the thoughts of her from his mind, a gnawing curiosity lingered, refusing to be ignored. The walls Nita had so carefully built around herself had always been unbreakable in Damon's eyes. But last night, for just a moment, she had been something else, vulnerable, raw. He had seen a crack in her armor, and it was enough to leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about her. Why had she hidden so much of herself? What had made her so distant, so cold? As he paced around the estate, an uneasy feeling coiled in his gut. The usual distractions didn't hold his attention anymore. The luxurious surroundings, the dazzling views, the endless wealth. None of it seemed to matter as much as it once did. His focus kept returning to Nita, to the emotional barrier between them, and to the truth that was clearly buried deep beneath the surface. He couldn't just let it go. Not after seeing her like that. The soft sound of footsteps broke his train of thought, and he turned to find Nita approaching him in the hallway. Her face was an impassive mask once again, but Damon could sense the tension in the air. It was like she was holding her breath, waiting for something to happen. "Good morning," he said, keeping his tone neutral, though his eyes betrayed the undercurrent of curiosity. She nodded curtly. "Morning." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Damon felt the weight of it pressing down on him, urging him to ask the questions that had been eating at him for days. "You weren't at training today," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Is everything all right?" Nita's eyes flickered, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the ground, as though gathering the right words. When she met his gaze again, there was a fleeting glimpse of uncertainty in her eyes, a crack in the armor she had so carefully built around herself. "I'm fine," she said, the words lacking conviction. "I just needed some time." Damon wasn't convinced. He had seen her like this before, when she was shutting down, retreating into herself. It was the same tactic she had used when he first arrived, when she wanted nothing to do with him. But something was different now. He wasn't about to let her brush him off so easily. "You don't need to hide it from me, Nita," he said, his voice softer now. "Whatever it is that's bothering you, you don't have to carry it alone." Her eyes hardened, and she took a step back, her expression tightening. "I don't need your pity, Damon." "I'm not offering pity," he countered, taking a step closer. "I'm offering understanding. You don't have to be so damn perfect all the time." Nita's jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists at her sides. For a moment, Damon thought she might lash out, but instead, she turned her back to him and walked toward the door. "I'm not here for your comfort," she said sharply. "We have a deal. That's it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." But Damon wasn't ready to give up. Not now, not when he was so close to understanding the woman behind the walls. He followed her, stepping into the doorway just as she was about to leave. She froze, her back rigid as she met his gaze. But this time there was something different in her eyes. Something that made his heart skip a beat. A flicker of hesitation, of doubt. "You're not alone, Nita," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than he had intended. "You don't have to do this all by yourself." Her lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but she stopped herself. The air between them thickened with tension, an unspoken battle of wills. Damon could feel the walls between them starting to crack, slowly but surely, and then, just as quickly, Nita turned away. "I don't need your help," she repeated, her voice cold, but it lacked the usual sharpness. There was something softer in her tone now, something almost weary. Damon didn't try to stop her this time. He stood there, watching as she walked away, the door clicking shut behind her. His chest tightened with a strange mix of frustration and understanding. He wanted to break through to her, to uncover the secrets she was so determined to hide. But Nita wasn't ready. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in a strange, tense silence. Damon spent hours pacing the halls, trying to clear his mind, but every thought kept returning to Nita. Her pain, her anger, the walls she had built around herself. What had happened to her? What had made her so afraid of trusting anyone? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the estate, Damon found himself standing outside once more, staring at the horizon. The stars were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky, and for a moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The weight of his thoughts was overwhelming, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Nita than she let on. More to this challenge, to this arrangement than he could see. He needed answers. Not just for himself, but for her. Nita's heart was a fortress. And if Damon wanted to get past her walls, he would have to understand the history behind them. And he was ready to do whatever it took. Just as he was about to turn back inside, a familiar voice called out to him, "Damon." He turned to find Nita standing at the edge of the garden, her figure outlined by the soft light of the setting sun. She was still a distance away, but there was something in the way she looked at him that stopped him in his tracks. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter now, hesitant. Maybe we should talk about things." Damon's heart raced as he took a step toward her, his mind a whirl of questions. Was this the breakthrough he had been waiting for? Or was this just another moment of vulnerability that she would quickly shut down? He didn't know, but for the first time he felt like they were on the same page. For the first time, it felt like Nita was ready to let him in. Damon walked toward Nita slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what had brought her to this point, the point where she was ready to talk. Whatever it was, it felt like a rare, fragile opportunity, an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. Nita stood still under the dimming sky, her posture as rigid as ever, but there was something in her eyes that had shifted. The usual defiance was absent, replaced by something more vulnerable, something Damon could barely comprehend. As he drew closer, he noticed how her hands fidgeted at her sides, her fingers curling and uncurling in a subtle show of anxiety. For a moment, she seemed almost human, not the formidable alien warrior, not the cold, distant instructor, but just a woman, struggling with something deep inside. "I didn't expect you to come," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the ground before her. "I told you before, Damon. You don't need to know." Damon stopped a few feet away from her, giving her the space she needed while still closing the distance. "I think I do," he said, his voice softer than before. "You've been shutting me out. I want to understand why." For a long moment, Nita didn't answer. She merely stared at the ground, her expression unreadable. Damon could tell she was weighing something in her mind. Something heavy. Something that had kept her silent for so long. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up, her gaze meeting his. "I wasn't always like this," she said, her voice low, as if testing the weight of her own words. "I didn't always shut people out, but it became easier. After everything." Damon's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken history that had shaped Nita into the person she was now. The walls she had built around herself weren't just about self-protection. They were the result of something much deeper, much darker. "What happened?" Damon asked, unable to stop himself. He had to know. There was a hunger inside him now, not just for the answers, but for the connection they both so desperately needed. Nita's eyes clouded with something like pain, something raw and real. She looked away, her lips pressing together as if to stop herself from saying more. Damon took a cautious step closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Nita, you don't have to keep hiding from me. I won't judge you." For a brief moment, her eyes flickered to his, the trust he had been slowly building between them shining through. But then, as if remembering the rules she had set in place, she turned away again, her shoulders stiffening. "I don't know how to explain it," she murmured. "Not without risking everything." Damon didn't push her. Instead, he waited. He knew it wasn't the right time to rush her, not when she was so clearly on the edge of breaking. His heart ached for her, for the pain that she had clearly been carrying alone for so long. "Do you trust me?" he asked quietly, the question more vulnerable than he had intended. "You've trusted me to be here, to train, to learn. But do you trust me enough to let me in?" Nita's eyes snapped to his, startled by the directness of his words. For a moment, she said nothing. Her lips parted as though she were struggling to find a response. Damon saw the internal battle in her eyes, the desire to protect herself, to keep him at arm's length, and the undeniable pull of something deeper. Something that wanted connection, wanted understanding. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had fallen off them. "I don't know how to do this, Damon," she confessed. I've spent so long keeping people away that I don't remember what it's like to let someone in. Damon's chest tightened with empathy, and he reached out instinctively, his hand resting lightly on her arm. You don't have to do it alone, he said gently. Not anymore. I'm here. I won't leave. She tensed at his touch but didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, her breathing uneven as if struggling with the emotions she had been holding back for so long. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. It's not that simple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been through things. Things that make it hard to believe anyone could care. Anyone could understand. Damon's heart beat faster, and he found himself leaning in, lowering his voice. You'd be surprised what I understand. You don't have to tell me everything all at once. But I'm here, Nita. I'm not going anywhere. The words seemed to sink into her, and for the first time, she didn't push him away. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she closed her eyes again, taking a slow breath. Her lips parted, and Damon felt the tension in the air shift. I was once part of a team, Nita began, her voice trembling slightly. A group of warriors. We were sent on missions to protect and to fight. But, she paused, her face contorting with the memory. Something went wrong. I failed them. I failed the people I cared about. Damon's breath hitched, his heart aching at the rawness of her words. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the depth of pain she was revealing. But he listened, watching her, feeling the gravity of the moment. They died because of me, Nita continued, her voice cracking. I couldn't save them. I couldn't protect the ones I loved. And because of that, I've never been able to forgive myself. So I built these walls. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that no one could ever get close enough to hurt me again. And I believed it. Damon's throat tightened, his mind struggling to process the depth of her pain. This was why she had been so distant, so guarded. She had lost so much, and in her grief, she had closed herself off from the world. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you. Nita's eyes softened, just slightly, as she met his gaze again. It's not just about what I lost, she said, her voice steadying. It's about what I was willing to sacrifice to protect others. And now I don't know if I can let anyone close enough to love me again. Damon felt his heart break for her. But in that moment, he realized something. Nita wasn't beyond saving. She wasn't beyond redemption. And if there was a way to help her heal, to help her rebuild, he would be the one to do it. You don't have to be perfect, Nita, he said softly. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you, flaws and all. For the first time, Nita looked at him without the armor. The walls she had built around herself had begun to crack, and Damon could see the person she had been before the pain, before the loss. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't invincible. But she was real, and that, he realized, was enough. The days that followed were a blur. After their conversation in the garden, Damon couldn't shake the weight of what Nita had shared with him. She had opened up in a way he hadn't expected, revealing the deep pain and loss that had shaped her into the woman he saw before him. It wasn't easy for either of them. There were moments of silence, of tension, and of moments where Nita retreated back into herself, the walls rising once more. But Damon didn't give up. He couldn't. Every day he tried to show her that he was there for her no matter what. Sometimes, it was a quiet touch on her arm or a brief glance across the room. Other times it was more direct, small gestures of kindness, of understanding. And slowly, inch by inch, he could see her begin to soften, to lower the walls she had spent so long building. But there was still so much left unsaid. The weight of her past hung over them both, and Damon knew they weren't finished. They couldn't be. It was late afternoon when he found her again, standing by the windows of the estate, staring out at the sprawling landscape beyond. The evening sun cast a golden glow over everything, and for a moment, Nita almost looked peaceful, untroubled. But Damon knew better. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands curled into fists at her sides. He walked over quietly, stopping a few feet behind her. His voice was low when he spoke, gentle yet insistent. Nita, we need to talk. She didn't turn to face him immediately, but he could tell she had heard him. She was still trying to decide whether or not she wanted to let him in again. What now? She asked, her voice guarded, though softer than usual. I thought we were past this. I thought so too, Damon replied, his voice steady. But there's more to this. I need to understand what's really going on inside of you. We can't keep pretending like this is just about the challenge between us. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a brief moment, Damon thought she might shut down again. But instead, she slowly turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of wariness and something else. Something deeper. I told you what happened, she said, her voice quieter now, almost tired. What more do you want? I don't want just the surface, Damon replied, his eyes softening. I want to know how it feels, what it did to you. You said you failed them, but it's more than that, isn't it? There's guilt there. A lot of it. Nita's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, Damon saw her mask falter. Her eyes closed, and she took a few steadying breaths, as if bracing herself for something. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You don't understand, she murmured. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to have people depend on you and then fail them. Could have saved them. I should have. I was supposed to be better than that. Damon took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I can't pretend to understand what you went through, Nita, but I know what it's like to live with regret, to feel like there's no way to fix what you've broken. But that doesn't mean you should carry it alone. Her eyes flickered with something, maybe hope, maybe doubt. She didn't pull away though, and that was a start. Damon slowly reached out, gently touching her shoulder. She stiffened for a moment but didn't move away. It's not just about the past, Nita continued, her voice shaky now. It's about what I became after. I was so afraid of letting anyone close to me, of trusting anyone, that I shut myself off. I focused on the mission, on the job. It became all I had left. And now I don't know how to be anything else. Damon's heart ached for her. She was still stuck in that place of pain, of not knowing who she was outside of her past. But in this moment, with her walls lowered just a little, Damon could see the vulnerability in her, raw and real. And he knew, no matter how long it took, he would help her through it. They would both get through it together. You don't have to keep being that person, Damon said, his voice firm but gentle. You don't have to carry that guilt anymore. You're not defined by your past, Nita, and you're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes remained on him, searching his face as though looking for any sign of insincerity. But Damon didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He meant every word. Finally, Nita let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can let go of all of it, she admitted. But I'm willing to try. Damon smiled softly, his heart swelling with hope. That's all I'm asking. One step at a time. For the rest of the evening, they stayed together, talking, slowly, carefully, about the things Nita had kept locked away for so long. Damon listened, never pushing, never rushing. He simply let her speak, let her begin the slow process of unpacking the weight of her past. It wasn't easy. There were moments where Nita became overwhelmed, where her emotions would threaten to break through. But Damon never wavered. He was there for her, steady and constant. By the time night had fully settled in, Nita was sitting by the fire, her posture less rigid than it had been in days. She still looked weary, but there was something different about her. Something lighter, as though a small part of the weight had been lifted. She met Damon's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something like hope in her gaze. Thank you, she said quietly, for listening, for not giving up on me. Damon smiled, the warmth in his chest spreading. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together. And for the first time, Nita believed him. The days following Nita's breakthrough were filled with small victories. Damon knew that healing wasn't linear. There were ups and downs, moments where Nita seemed to be making progress, and others where she retreated back into the defensive shell she had built over the years. But every time she pulled away, Damon was there, patiently waiting for her to come back. And bit by bit, she did. Each conversation, each quiet moment shared between them, built the foundation for something real, something that went beyond the bet, beyond the challenge. But despite all the progress, Damon couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking beneath the surface. He had caught glimpses of it in Nita's eyes, the remnants of the trauma she had endured, the unresolved guilt that still held her hostage. He knew that, until she faced it head-on, she would never truly be free. It was early morning when the moment came. Nita stood by the edge of the training grounds, her arms crossed over her chest as she looked out over the expansive view of the estate. The sky was tinged with the soft hues of dawn, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to shift. Damon approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. He had learned to read the subtle cues she gave off, her tense posture, the slight quiver of her lips, the way her eyes never seemed to quite focus. She was bracing herself for something, he knew that much. "You're still thinking about it?" he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "Aren't you?" Nita didn't respond right away. She didn't even look at him. But Damon could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. "I can't stop," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I can't shake the feeling that if I don't face it, everything we've worked for will fall apart. I can't move forward if I'm still carrying all this inside." Damon stepped closer, his heart aching for her. She was still so uncertain, still so afraid of what letting go would mean. And yet, in those words, he heard something else, a willingness to finally confront the past. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also liberating. She was ready to break free. "You don't have to do this alone," Damon said, his voice low, full of conviction. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere." Nita finally turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself," she confessed, her voice shaking slightly. "I failed them. I failed everyone. I don't know if I deserve to be better." Damon took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "No one is perfect, Nita. We all make mistakes. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from them. That doesn't mean we can't change. And it certainly doesn't mean you don't deserve to be happy." For a long moment, Nita stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Damon could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to believe him, that wanted to let go, but still clung to the guilt that had been her constant companion for so long. "Nita," Damon said gently, stepping even closer until there was almost no distance between them. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking you to let go of the weight. Let go of the idea that your past defines you. Let go of the idea that you're not worthy of a future." She blinked, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the words. "What if I can't? What if the past is too much to overcome?" Damon placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch light but reassuring. "Then we'll take it one step at a time. Together. I promise you won't face this alone." There was a long silence between them, one that seemed to stretch for ages. Damon held his breath, waiting for her to respond, for her to make a choice. And then, finally, Nita let out a long, shuddering breath. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "But I'll try. I'll try for us." Damon's heart soared. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was the beginning of something real, a promise to move forward, even if it meant facing the darkness of the past head-on. He smiled at her, his gaze softening. "That's all I ask." Nita looked up at him, her expression still uncertain but more open than it had been before. "You're really willing to help me?" she asked, her voice small. "Even after everything I've put you through?" Damon's heart thudded in his chest, the answer coming without hesitation. "I'm here for you. I'm here because I believe in you. I believe in us." She stared at him for a long moment, as though searching for something in his eyes, something that would tell her he meant every word. And then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm scared," she said, her voice thick with emotion. But, I'll try. Damon took a deep breath, his hand still resting on her shoulder. We'll take it one step at a time. Together. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as they prepared for what would come next. Nita was quiet, contemplative, but there was a new determination in her. Something Damon hadn't seen before. She was finally beginning to accept that the past didn't define her, that her mistakes didn't have to be her legacy. They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, moving through their routines with a new sense of ease. It wasn't perfect. Nita still had her moments of retreat, still had times when the weight of her past seemed to overwhelm her. But Damon was there, always waiting for her to return. And little by little, he saw the cracks in her armor widen, just enough for him to catch glimpses of the woman she could become. As night fell, Nita and Damon sat side by side under the stars. The world around them was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Nita allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't whole, not yet, but she was on the path, and that was enough for now. Damon turned to her, his eyes warm. "You're not alone, Nita," he said, his voice quiet but full of promise. "Not anymore." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else. Something deeper, something more intimate. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying with me, for believing in me." Damon smiled softly, his heart full. Always. The weeks that followed marked a turning point for both Damon and Nita. They had worked through their pain together, step by step, and though the journey hadn't been easy, it had forged a bond between them that was stronger than either of them had expected. The bet that had started it all, Damon's challenge to win Nita's heart, seemed like a distant memory now. What had begun as a transaction, as a game, had transformed into something real, something grounded in mutual respect and, unexpectedly, love. Nita had started to trust again, allowing herself to believe in something other than the ghosts of her past. And Damon, he had grown in ways he never imagined possible. What had begun as a challenge had turned into a profound lesson in vulnerability, patience, and forgiveness. And now, as they faced the end of this chapter, Damon realized that what they had wasn't just a redemption story. It was a partnership, built on the quiet understanding that they would never have to face their struggles alone. It was late afternoon when Damon found himself standing in the courtyard of the estate, watching as Nita practiced her training routines. She was focused, fluid in her movements, and he couldn't help but admire her strength. But it wasn't just the physical strength that he saw now, it was the emotional strength she had developed. The woman who had once kept her heart locked away was now someone who embraced her flaws and worked through them. Not just for herself, but for the two of them. Damon had been watching her from the doorway for a few moments when Nita stopped mid-move and turned to face him. Her breath was steady, her eyes clear. She had come so far since the day they had first met, and Damon had to fight the urge to smile too broadly. He had never imagined this, never thought that the woman who had seemed so distant and impenetrable would become someone he couldn't imagine his life without. "You're staring," Nita said, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Damon chuckled softly, stepping closer. Guilty as charged. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand before crossing her arms in front of her, a small glimmer of challenge in her eyes. "I hope you're not getting distracted from your work. I'm not here for your entertainment." He raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in his gaze. "I'm always entertained when I watch you." Nita gave him a mock glare, though it was clear she didn't mind his attention. "You're a terrible flirt," she said, shaking her head. But the edge of her tone was soft, affectionate. She had become more comfortable with his teasing, even if it was a side of Damon that she had initially been wary of. But that was the thing about their relationship now. The barriers had broken down, piece by piece, until what remained was something far more meaningful than either of them could have imagined. They had both changed through the process. Their initial mistrust, the game they played, the rawness of their conversations had all woven together to form a bond that neither of them was willing to break. "Hey, Nita," Damon began, his tone shifting slightly as he reached out, his expression growing more serious. Her eyes softened, sensing the change. "What's up?" He walked toward her, stopping just a few steps away. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, a weight that had lingered between them since the beginning. But now it was different. It was no longer a weight of guilt or uncertainty. It was a weight of shared understanding, of forgiveness. "I've been thinking a lot," Damon said, his voice lower than usual. "About everything. About us." Nita raised an eyebrow, her arms uncrossing as she gave him her full attention. "Everything, huh?" He nodded, taking another step closer. "I know it wasn't always easy for you to believe me when I said I was here for you, and I get that. But I want you to know that I never saw you as a challenge. Not really. Not after I got to know you." Nita's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in her gaze. She hadn't expected this conversation to go in that direction. "Damon." He held up a hand, silencing her. "Let me finish. You taught me something about myself that I didn't even realize I needed to learn. I came into this thinking it was just about me winning, proving something to myself. But what I found was something I wasn't expecting. A woman who is so much more than her past. A woman who, despite everything, has the courage to keep going. And that's what made me fall for you." There was a long pause. Nita stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the weight of his words. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. It made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't used to. And yet, it made her heart swell in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I never thought I'd hear that," Nita whispered. "Not from you." Damon smiled, his eyes warm and full of sincerity. "I never thought I'd be saying it either. But I'm glad I did." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Damon could see the wheels turning in Nita's head, the hesitation she still carried within her. But there was something different about the way she looked at him now. Something that spoke of a deep trust. A trust that hadn't existed when their journey had started. Nita stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hand gently resting on his chest. Damon's breath caught in his throat at the gesture. Her touch was steady, warm, and for the first time, Damon realized that Nita was no longer just playing a role in this relationship. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was here with him in this moment. "I don't know what the future holds," Nita said quietly, "but I'm willing to take that step with you, one at a time. If you'll have me." Damon's heart soared. He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I'll have you. Always." Nita smiled. A slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a smile that Damon knew he would cherish for the rest of his life. Together, they had faced the shadows of their pasts. Together, they had chosen to move forward, to let go of the guilt, the fear, and the uncertainty. And as they stood there, hand in hand, Damon realized that this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, Damon didn't fear it. With Nita by his side, he knew they could face anything. And as the sun set behind them, casting the world in golden light, Damon felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. They had both learned the hard way that love wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing each other, day after day, even when the past tried to pull them back. For Damon and Nita, it was more than redemption. It was a new beginning,